Hello, my name is Katie Newton. I'm a graduate student at the University of Louisville. This is a research article review for my preschool language intervention course. The article I will be reviewing is entitled Preschool Children with Intellectual Disability, Syndrome Specificity, Behavioral Problems, and Maternal Well-Being. This article is written by A.S. Eisenhower, Bruce L. Baker, and J. Blatcher. A little overview on this article before we get started is that we're going to be talking about children with intellectual disabilities, also referred to as ID. We will be talking about how these children are at a greater risk for behavioral problems as well as mental disorder diagnosis. We will also be discussing mothers of these children and how their stress levels are more heightened than those mothers of typically developing children. The research that we're looking at is to see if there's a syndrome-specific link between these behavioral problems and mental disorders and the stress level that it places on these mothers. Review of relevant data. There is an increased risk of individuals with ID developing behavioral and mental disorders in adulthood. Eisenhower, Baker, and Blanchard stated that researchers estimate that 20 to 35% of adults with ID will be diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. Also, there has been a rising negative impact on parents' well-being that is associated with the increasing stress level of parenting a child with ID. Research has been conducted on school-aged children and adolescents, and it has been key in uncovering that individuals with intellectual disorders are at a greater risk for an associated psychiatric disorder. Specifically, children with intellectual disabilities seem to be at a heightened risk for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, conduction disorder, anxiety disorders, and pervasive developmental disorders. Current study and problem. Current research efforts in this area have been focused on calculating the occurrence and nature of these psychiatric problems that are found among children with ID, while research focusing on finding the reason behind this dual diagnosis seems to be less pronounced. Researchers are beginning to highlight the fact that specific syndromes associated with ID may have direct effects on children's behavior and psychiatric problems, as well as the indirect effects of the adjustment on the caregivers and the family. The research questions of this study. Research question number 1. Are there syndrome-related differences in behavioral problems? Research question number 2. Are there syndrome-related differences in maternal well-being? And finally, research question number 3. Is there syndrome-specific variation in maternal well-being even after cognitive delay and behavioral problems are accounted for? And now to look at the methods section. This study looked at preschool-aged children from age 3 to 5 and their mothers. In the complete sample, there were children with specific syndromes associated with ID: Down syndrome, autism, cerebral palsy, as well as undifferentiated developmental delays in children without developmental delays. Here's a look at the participants. There were 215 families with a 3-year-old with or without developmental delays recruited between 30 to 40 months of age. 24% of these families came from rural Pennsylvania, and 76% came from Southern California. All children were ambulatory and not diagnosed with autism at the time of recruitment. They scored between a 30 and 75 on the Bayley Scales of Infant Development, 2nd edition, at age 3. And children with undifferentiated developmental delays were only retained if they also scored below an 85 on the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale, 4th edition, at age 5. Here's what the procedure looked like. Data was collected through home visits, laboratory sessions, and mailed questionnaires at 36, 48, and 60 months. Prior to this initial visit, parents received project descriptions and the informed consent form and completed a telephone interview with project staff. 2 trained examiners visited the family's home for 2 hours. After reviewing study procedures, answering questions, and obtaining parental informed consent, they administered the BSID second edition to the child. During this testing, the child's mother and father, if present, completed the child behavioral checklist and a demographic questionnaire, including information about the child's health and development. The following tests were used on the children, which would be in the materials section. The Bailey Scale of Infant Development, second edition. The Child Behavioral Checklist for ages 1.5 to 5. The Family Impact Questionnaire, and the Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale. Now for the results section. The results revealed, first, that syndrome-specific behavioral patterns are present in children ages 3, typically stay fairly stable throughout their preschool careers. Second, we found that syndromes did influence maternal stress above and beyond the influence of cognitive ability and behavioral patterns, which highlights the need for the identification of further factors other than behavioral problems that may vary by syndrome. And finally, lastly, thirdly, we found, or not we, but the authors found, that interventions that are targeted to specific syndromes of ID and their associated behavioral and psychiatric problems would be beneficial for parents and caregivers and families in therapy settings and or in just their daily activities that they would be doing throughout the day. Drum roll, please. It's time for the critique. Overall, I thought this article was very interesting and informative. It was a pretty easy read. I mean, a little long, but what article isn't long? A couple of things I have to say is I kind of thought it was weird that, 27% of the people were chosen from a rural area in Pennsylvania, and then the remaining 70-some% were chosen from California. And I feel like it would be interesting to look at if lifestyle had an effect, like if those two groups differed from each other, the California versus Pennsylvania, because you have to think about availability to therapists and doctors. You can kind of wonder if that plays in, and even lifestyle, a rural lifestyle, real traditional background versus California, which is kind of like fun, free, spirited, if things like that could have tweaked the results any. I also thought it was interesting they talked about maternal well-being a lot, but in this day and age, sometimes the father is the prime caregiver, and sometimes he's the breadwinner, sometimes he's both. So I think it would have been interesting to compare fathers versus mothers' stress in that type of environment. And I mean, even in this day and age, we have same-sex families where the parents are the same sex. So would both mothers, if it was a two-mother family, have the same stress level, or would one be less than the other? I don't know, just things that I thought would be interesting to look at. And I also wondered how much they took other factors into the whole stress situation. I mean, do you have marital issues? Do you have financial issues? Does the child have a sibling? Does that play into it? Because I feel like a mother with several children would obviously be way more stressed than a mother with just one child, I guess you should say. So I just thought there were a lot of different factors they could have looked at. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad study. I thought it was actually very interesting. I think it's kind of neat that they looked at, do syndromes specifically line up with different behavioral disabilities? Because that would be greatly beneficial in therapy sessions, especially if you knew, like, oh, I have a kid with Down syndrome. These kids are most likely to do A, B, and C, so you could already have backed up in your plan. Guess I'm kind of getting into the next part of this review, but like I said, this critique, I'd have to be a good critique for them. There were just some things that I thought would be interesting to add on to this study for next time, like maybe looking at some different disabilities. I know they looked at autism, cerebral palsy, and Down syndrome, but I think the door is wide open to look at other disabilities to see if this same like dual diagnosis of behavioral problems with an ID disability kind of goes across the whole board. So those are just some of my thoughts. If you guys have more, please share. Now, in conclusion, the clinical applications. So this is the clinical implications. Kind of ran into this during the critique. Like I said before, I thought this article was really good, and if they could pair syndrome-specific behavioral issues with certain syndromes, that would give us an even greater insight on how to plan therapy. If you know a child's going to be very fidgety and needs a fidget to play with or some sort of special seating, then you can already have that in place before your therapy starts, which would be awesome. It also gives us some insight to keep in mind that maybe we need to have a behavioral backup plan in our minds for all settings. You never know when a kid's just had a rough day at school and they're not going to cooperate with you during therapy. So it's kind of good to always, maybe think about things like this in the back of your mind. I also thought this article gave you great insight to what the family life might be like for a child with ID. And I thought it brought up a very good point to keep in mind the basic behavioral principle, which we talked about in class. If you give a family too much to do, they're not going to do it. They have a gajillion other things to do with their time, and your therapy homework might not be one of them. So maybe work in your homework and some therapy ideas into the child's bedtime routine or their morning routine. Make it something the whole family can do. So it's less of a one more thing to do tonight and more of a like, oh, let's read this book together. Oh, let's go to the park and play this game. So therapy is more likely to be done at home as well as in a therapy session, so we can get maximum exposure to these children because they do need it. So I thought that was kind of cool because you kind of get a glimpse into the child's mind because they have this disability and now they've got this behavioral problem and there might be a psychiatric problem and everything's going on in there. And then you also have a glimpse at the family life and how there is some added stress to these families, and it's our job to kind of ease that load and not add any more. The references.